Welcome and thank you for being part of the North Carolina Museum of Art's inaugural commemorating Juneteenth weekend celebration. My name is Maria Lopez and I'm the manager of film and lecture programs at the museum. We are so very grateful to have you here in person and virtually on this very special and now national holiday. I know many of you were expecting a conversation with Linda Simmons Henry, author of Culture Town, but unfortunately she was not able to join us today. Our event today is now Understanding Juneteenth, a discussion with award-winning historian, Dr. Crystal R. Sanders. We would like to thank our presenting sponsor, First Citizens Bank, for their support of this weekend's programming, and also thank the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated Phi Lambda chapter for co-sponsoring the event. I know there are a few members here in the audience, so let us know if you're here. Raise your hand. We would also like to extend a special thank you to those of you who are members and invite the rest of you to join the museum today to begin to enjoy early and discounted access to exhibitions, movies, and summer concerts. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the NCMA's Director of Performing Arts and Film, Moses T. Alexander Green.
Great afternoon, everyone. It is so wonderful to see each of you. And my comments are going to be, first, an introduction of our wonderful executive director, Dr. Valerie Hillings. Dr. Hillings.
Thank you, Moses, and welcome, everyone. This is so exciting for us. As you heard, it is our inaugural Juneteenth weekend celebration and is so fitting in this only 2 days since it's become a national holiday. So we're thrilled to be but a small part of that. Grateful that Moses and his arrival here brought together the idea of creating a series of events, including the lecture today. But also last night we kicked off our first outdoor concert of the season, and indeed in 2 years really, with Sweet Honey in the Rock. I think many of you came for that. It was such a thrill and so many wonderful, a wonderful spirit to have everybody back together and to celebrate with music. I want to also thank the Phi Lambda chapter of the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. We're so excited to have many of you here today, based in Wake and Johnston County, I should add, the chapter. I'm particularly excited to welcome a fellow Duke graduate, Dr. Sanders, today to share with us the history of Juneteenth, and hope very much that you will all stay and enjoy it with us, and also welcome our friend, Dr. Bennett. So thank you so much. I know you're here to hear them. So, but I also just want to add one last piece about the North Carolina Museum of Art. Our new vision statement reflects much of what we're hoping to think about today, is that this museum can serve as a vital cultural resource across the entire state and forge a path as a national leader in creating a welcoming experience of belonging and joy. And the focus for us on joy feels so profoundly important coming out of last year, looking at the opportunity to move beyond some of the challenges of the past and into hopefully a more unified future. So thank you very much and enjoy the program.
Thank you.
Let's give Dr. Hillings a hand, please. I'd like to give some information about our distinguished guest today. I'm getting older, so I have to do this now. Dr. Crystal R. Sanders is an award-winning historian of the United States in the 20th century. Her research and teaching interests include African American history, Black women's history, and the history of Black education. She received her BA in history and public policy from Duke University and a Ph.D. in history from Northwestern University. Dr. Everett B. Ward is a former member of the Raleigh Historical Properties Commission and the 35th General President of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, the nation's first African American intercollegiate Greek lettered organization, Fraternity, Dr. Ward has volunteered some 34 years to preserve and to document African American history. So I present to some and introduce the others, Dr. Everett B. Ward and Dr. Crystal R. Sanders. It will begin with a discussion led by Dr. Sanders. Dr. Sanders.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to have the opportunity to share a few remarks and then engage in a conversation with all of you and with Dr. Ward on Juneteenth and the significance of this holiday to African Americans. In my short time with you today, I'm going to talk briefly about Juneteenth, and then I'm going to talk about African Americans as institution builders and community builders in the United States. I am very thankful to Mr. Moses T. Green and Dr. Everett Ward for the invitation. And let me just say to the co-sponsors of this event, the Phi Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, my father was initiated into that very chapter probably 30 years ago. He has gone inactive, but maybe he will rejoin. I'm nudging him to rejoin and reactivate his membership. I want to begin by sharing part of an oration from perhaps the first nationally known Black leader in America, Frederick Douglass. On July 5th, 1852, addressing a standing room only crowd in Rochester, New York, Douglass delivered the speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" Highlighting the contradiction of a nation with millions in bondage, celebrating the ideals of freedom and liberty. Douglass said, and I quote, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all of the other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impotence. Your shout of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour." End quote. Douglass made plain the fact that freedom simply cannot exist without emancipation. What this means for all of us gathered here today is that we should really think of Juneteenth as the day on the calendar when the United States moved closer to its professed creed that all men are created equal. It's a day that the United States moved closer to its professed ideal that all men are endowed with their creator with certain rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So just to make sure we are all on the same page, I want to quickly provide an overview of Juneteenth. What is it really? Why does it matter? Juneteenth commemorates what happened on June 19th, 1865, 2 months after the Confederacy surrendered, when a Union general accompanied by nearly 2,000 soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, and read what was known as General Order Number 3, officially informing 250,000 enslaved people in Texas of their freedom 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Many people have wondered or pondered why it took so long for enslaved people in Texas to learn that they were free. And many surmise that it just took a long time for word to travel to the Lone Star State. We all know, however, that news, whether good or bad, travels fast. Enslaved people in Texas were not aware that the war was over and that they were free because of white resistance to the Union victory. White Texans had no desire for African Americans to learn the truth. They hoped to get yet another harvest out of uncompensated Black labor. They, meaning white planters in Texas, did not believe in anything other than white supremacy. So emancipation was something to be delayed as long as possible. This kind of dogged resistance to Black freedom is the reason why it took 156 years after the Civil War for our nation to implement a legal holiday celebrating the emancipation of 4 million Black people whose uncompensated labor and the uncompensated labor of their ancestors built this country. Now, there are many misconceptions of Juneteenth that I think we need to clear up. First, many people say that on Juneteenth, Black Texans learned that 2.5 years earlier, President Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. Let me be very clear. The Emancipation Proclamation did not really free anyone. The proclamation, if you actually read it, only freed slaves in rebelling states, but white people living in those rebellious states did not consider themselves subject to the rules and laws of the United States. Remember, the Confederate States of America had their own president, Jefferson Davis. So Confederates did not see themselves subject to an order written by the President of the United States. President Lincoln, however, did have the power to free enslaved people in Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, slaveholding states that remained loyal to the Union. But Lincoln chose not to do so. Since those 4 states were not in rebellion, the proclamation had no meaning to the slaves living there. Now, before any of you accuse me of dismissing the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation entirely, I will say that there were significant consequences of the proclamation, with the most significant consequence being it made it very clear to everyone that the Civil War was about slavery. Additionally, the proclamation influenced the main actors of the war. By 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, the Confederate States of America were very short on supplies, and they hoped to gain support from European countries, 2 countries in particular that the Confederates were making appeals to for aid, and those countries were France and Great Britain. These 2 nations, however, had already abolished slavery and therefore had no desire to help another country preserve slavery. Without foreign support and recognition, it was much more difficult for the Confederacy to defeat Union forces. So see, when the Emancipation Proclamation truly made the war about slavery, then at that point, foreign nations did not want to get involved. The other reason why we can say that the Emancipation Proclamation was significant is because it gave President Lincoln the authority to enlist Black troops. And we know that as soon as that proclamation went into effect, hundreds of thousands of Black men ran to Union lines and volunteered for military service. Now, another misconception that we must contend with is the idea that on Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, slavery was abolished everywhere in the United States. That's not the case. Juneteenth commemorates when the last Confederate state, Texas, abolished slavery. It would not be until December 6, 1865, when slavery ended in Kentucky and Delaware, 2 states that had been loyal to the Union, and slavery doesn't end in those states until ratification of the 13th Amendment. So we celebrate today as an Emancipation Day, but on June 19, 1865, there were still enslaved people living in the United States. So once again, it makes us think of this Emancipation Proclamation, because back in 1863, Lincoln had control over Kentucky and Delaware. These were slaveholding states that had remained loyal to the Union. He chose not to free enslaved people in the states where he actually had the power to do so. So it took the ratification of the 13th Amendment to truly bring emancipation to all enslaved people in this nation. Now, after emancipation, formerly enslaved people created their own schools, organizations, and towns as a way to secure and preserve their freedom. Hear me and hear me well. Freed men and freed women did not wait on the federal government, the Freedmen's Bureau, or Northern organizations to acquire the markers of freedom that they desired. Understanding the power of collective action, Black men and women pooled their meager resources to buy land and set up schools. For example, formerly enslaved men who fought in the 62nd United States Colored Infantry during the Civil War began setting aside part of their monthly salary as soldiers to establish a school for African Americans in Missouri. With each donation, these former slaves turned soldiers signed their names with a cross because they could not read or write. Slavery had denied them the gift of literacy. Their monthly donations led to the establishment of present-day Lincoln University of Missouri, which was founded in 1866. In some parts of Mississippi, the formerly enslaved acquired Bibles or primers and transformed parts of the big houses into classrooms with semi-literate teachers even before Northern educators arrived south. Such initiative demonstrated the priority that freed people placed on education and their desire to control their own schools. We can also see Freedmen's initiative through the creation of Black teachers organizations that advocated for quality educational opportunities for Black students. Every border and southern state had a Black teachers group, and these groups strategized about the best ways to teach Black students and the best ways to secure money for Black education. Right here in North Carolina, the All-Black North Carolina Teachers Association founders included several formerly enslaved individuals. The first organizational meeting for the North Carolina Teachers Association was held in Raleigh in 1880, with 28 Black educators present. The meeting was called after the State Board of Education decided to discard textbooks that were balanced and free of sectional bias and replace them with textbooks that contained many falsehoods, including the lie that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. Beginning in 1881, North Carolina Teachers Association members met annually and discussed a variety of topics, including pedagogical trends, school discipline, teacher salary rates, and public funding for Black schools. While the organization's leadership changed over time, its steely commitment to quality Black education remained until the group merged with the all-white North Carolina Education Association in 1970. Black people understood that freedom was contested, that it was fraught, and that it was something that could never be taken for granted. Thus, in addition to creating Black schools and Black organizations, another way in which formerly enslaved people protected their freedom was by creating all Black communities that were free of white surveillance and control. In fact, the first town incorporated by African Americans in the United States is right here in North Carolina. Princeville, a town in Edgecombe County, was incorporated in 1885. It was originally called Freedom Hill, but the name was later changed to Princeville in honor of Turner Prince, an African-American man who had been involved in building many of the community's houses. Princeville demonstrates the desire African-Americans had for self-determination after slavery. The African-Americans who founded the town wanted a safe place to live and fellowship outside of the purview of whites. They wanted to govern themselves, control their own schools, and have the opportunity to occupy the public sphere without harm. And indeed, they did just that. Even after a violent white supremacist campaign stripped Black men of political participation at the federal and state levels in North Carolina and across the South, Black men in Princeville continued to participate in municipal elections. By 1910, Princeville's population had increased to 636. Half of its adult residents could read and write, and the town had an impressive number of Black businesses. Here in Raleigh, there were several Black communities established after emancipation, although none of these communities ever became incorporated like Princeville. Perhaps one of the most famous was the community of Method, a Southwest Raleigh neighborhood founded by formerly enslaved men in the 1870s. In 1872, two freedmen by the names of Jesse Mason and Isaac O'Kelly bought 69 acres of land from William Ruffin Cox, who had been a general in the Confederate Army. Mason and O'Kelly subdivided the land and sold it to former slaves. They built and sold one-story log cabins or slab houses with dirt floors. In the 1870s and 1880s, this community would be known as Plank Town or Slab Town because of these houses. Barry O'Kelly, a relative of one of the community founders, was born in Orange County and raised in Plank Town. He worked at the general store in Plank Town and later bought it, becoming its owner. He was able to get the railroad to establish a railroad spur at Plank Town, bringing more residents and badly needed commerce to the area. He also successfully established a post office in the community, and it was the United States Post Office that assigned the name Method to the community in 1890. In 1914, Barry O'Kelly transformed Method's one-room schoolhouse into a teacher training and boarding school for African Americans. The Barry O'Kelly School, as it was known, was one of only 3 fully accredited Black high schools in North Carolina in the early part of the 20th century. As Kate Pattison, a Raleigh resident and a columnist for the Raleigh Public Record, found, by the 1950s, Method was still a rural community with dirt roads and no sewage or water systems. Residents began to erect street signs to protect their community from the city of Raleigh that inched closer and closer to their boundaries. Despite their best efforts to avoid annexation, in the 1960s, Raleigh annexed Method. One of the ways in which Method's residents demanded that the city acknowledge the community's rich Black history was by demanding that officials use the original street names created by Method's leaders. So if you go through Raleigh, not too far, I guess, from Meredith, there's a street called Beryl Street, and Beryl was the name of Barry O'Kelly's daughter. So many of those streets retained their names that were given to them by Method's Black founders. Now, I mentioned Princeville and Method in this commemoration of Juneteenth because these all Black communities were tangible evidence of the hopes, dreams, and the fears of African Americans in the decades after emancipation. We know that nationwide, at least 60 Black communities were settled between 1865 and 1915. Their existence shows that many thought Black freedom was only possible in Black-controlled spaces. As Juneteenth becomes a federally recognized holiday this year, paraphrasing Frederick Douglass, I want to ask, what to the American is Juneteenth in 2021? During a time when police violence against African Americans continues to be a nationwide problem, during a time when healthcare remains elusive for many in the middle of a pandemic, and during a time when the United States has the highest prison population rate in the world. I want to challenge all of you to think about the ways in which formerly enslaved people defined freedom and ask yourself, in what ways can you honor their definitions in our present day battles? Black towns gave Black people control over municipal government. They were able to play a meaningful role in electoral politics. Today, we see states doing away with early voting and making it harder for people to register, let alone cast a ballot. One way to give meaning to this new federal holiday is to advocate for a stronger Voting Rights Act, to take part in voter registration drives, and to shuttle people to the polls when we get to election season. We also know that formerly enslaved people valued education. We can honor their commitment and make Juneteenth memorable or meaningful by getting involved in our public schools, even if we don't have a child in those schools. We can write to our county commissioners and encourage them to allocate more money to public education. We can speak up and out against school resegregation. We can demand that our students receive accurate and inclusive accounts of this country's history, which would include critical race theory. There is no way that one can celebrate Juneteenth and not want to examine the ways in which racism has affected every facet of life in the United States. As we think about the numerous Black settlements that were established in the wake of emancipation, we can actively work to counter gentrification by demanding affordable housing and calling for rent control. The history and lessons of Juneteenth offer us a blueprint of how to move forward, but we must be willing to fully reckon with the past and gain a better understanding of who we are as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you.
At this time, we will have a discussion led by our moderator. There will be time for 6 questions at the end. If you have 6, I'm going to stop at 6. We're going to run this like live television. If you know that you want to ask a question based on our discussion or based on what has been presented, I ask that you would begin to come whenever that question comes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's give Mr. Green a round of applause. Thank you for this. First of all, I think another round of applause is in order for Dr. Sanders. What an outstanding presentation. Thank you. Dr. Sanders, you so eloquently and scholarly presented what former enslaved people of African descent requested after the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth: access to education, also access to their own freedom and self-determination, as you defined, by having their own living accommodations outside of the plantation, household, social, political, and economic structure. And then finally, also access to fair payment for services provided with wages for labor and service. Let's revisit some of those again. First, the access to education. It was, as you so well stated, and people often forget, it was against the law for a person of African descent or African heritage to even read or write. It was against the law, and that speaks to institutionalized racism. Can you speak to that again?
Sure. One of the things that I oftentimes like to do in my classes is to show land documents or land deeds for the years, the 25 years after emancipation. So from 1865 till about 1890. And I passed, and typically I'm using North Carolina land deeds, but I passed them around to my students and I asked them, what do they notice about the documents? And unfortunately, most of my students never figure out what I want them to notice. And it's typically the X, right? Seeing formerly enslaved people signing legal documents with an X because they have been denied literacy. They've been denied the privilege of learning how to read and write. What I find when I explain this to my students, I say, this is how we can explain the proliferation of Black schools immediately after emancipation, right? Whether we're seeing rural Black schools starting in Black churches, right? Starting in bush harbors, or we see the beginnings of what we call today historically Black colleges and universities. There was a huge desire on the part of freed people to educate themselves because they saw that as a way to secure their freedom. They saw that as a way of distancing themselves from their enslaved past. And so really, this commitment to education that we see in Black communities has continued up to the present day. So whether it is trying to ensure that Black students even today are giving quality education, ensuring that Black students are not overrepresented in special education or overrepresented in school suspension and expulsions, we see that there is a commitment on behalf of Black communities to continue to ensure that Black children are able to reach their highest potentials. And this commitment we can trace directly, really even before the Civil War ends, as enslaved people are doing whatever they can to learn to read and write. If we think about Frederick Douglass, he talks about how he kind of self-taught himself by encouraging, white children that he played with to teach him a few letters here or there. And then he would study newspapers and study the Bible. And that's a common story among enslaved people. And that is how we can understand the efforts we see after emancipation to open these Black schools. And it's done in a number of ways. When we think of North Carolina, there are more Rosenwald schools in North Carolina than in any southern state. So when we think about Rosenwald schools, Julian Rosenwald was the head of Sears Roebuck. And really, as a birthday present to Booker T. Washington, he agreed to begin investing money in Black education in the South. But there was a stipulation attached to Rosenwald funds, and that stipulation was that Black communities had to match whatever Rosenwald provided. And really, we see that Black communities not only matched it, but they were giving 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and they're really pooling their meager resources. These are people who don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of means, but they understand the value of education. They understand the value of ensuring that young people in particular had the chance to learn to read and write, and they are willing to give their last dollar to make it happen. And so when we think about a state like North Carolina, having more Rosenwald schools than any other southern state means that African Americans from the coast to the mountains really decided that that was going to be their main investment. That was going to be one of the ways that they secured full freedom for themselves and for their families.
And it's also important to note that in many instances, the Rosenwald schools also had parents and children in those classrooms learning, parents in the evening, children during the day, learning to read and write, and particularly wanting to learn how to read the Bible and then advance from there as well. It's also important to note, as you have already mentioned, there are more historically Black colleges and universities in the state of North Carolina than any other state of the nation. You want to talk about that?
I mean, that is very true. We think about the oldest HBCU in the nation is in North Carolina, Shaw University. The oldest HBCU in the South, is in North Carolina, Shaw University. And we can see that there are schools, dotted throughout the state. And really, again, that shows a commitment of formerly enslaved people pooling their resources, of working with northern white institutions, and also putting pressure on state leaders to ensure that African Americans have some of the same opportunities that were afforded to white students. And I really think, North Carolina has a rich history of, people who oftentimes aren't really remembered in everyday conversation. People like J.C. Price from Livingston College, or we think about Seabrooks, Fayetteville State. These were men who really used their position, who used their clout, who used every dime that they had and every dime that they could secure to really provide opportunities for Black children. When I think of North Carolina's HBCUs, I think about the fact that these are institutions that have, as I like to say, punch above their weight class, meaning they've been able to do so much with so little. Even today, we see that many of our schools are not receiving the levels of funding that I think they should receive, yet they're able time and time again to produce classes after class after class of young people who then go on to make their mark on really not just on North Carolina, but to make their mark on a world stage. So if we think about someone like Ella Baker coming out of Shaw University, or we think, there's a million people I could think of, I could mention, but Ella Baker is a personal favorite of mine. But really looking at the ways in which these HBCUs have trained scholars who have then gone out and changed the world, who've gone out and worked to make the United States live up to its creed, who've gone out to make this a more perfect union. And a lot of that is the nurturing and the education that they received at these institutions that were in large part funded by the dreams and the sweat equity of formerly enslaved people.
Dr. Sanders, a continuation of that legacy also with your current book project, where you are looking at the continuation of how segregation impacted education, particularly to African Americans, furthering their education as graduate students. Can you share with the audience your work on that?
I love talking about my current book project. So I am a historian of Black education, and my first book looked at Head Start in Mississippi, but I'm now looking at graduate education in the South. And to make a long story short, Southern states used to pay Black students to go north or west for graduate school as a way of preserving segregation. So I am a North Carolina native, meaning really throughout the age of Jim Crow, or the era of legal segregation, the only public institution in the state that offered graduate study or study beyond the bachelor's degree was the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. North Carolina, beginning in 1939, set aside tax dollars to send Black students north or west to receive a medical degree, to receive a Ph.D., to receive a master's degree, to receive an MBA, as a way of preserving segregation. So that's what the book is about. And while 17 states did this, not just North Carolina, but all of the states of the former Confederacy, and then all of the border states, I'm looking at 4 states in particular. And those states are North Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, and Missouri. And I use these 4 states to kind of provide an overview of what I call these segregation scholarships. The first state to implement segregation scholarships was the state of Missouri. And they began this in 1921. The last state to implement segregation scholarships was the state of Mississippi, and they did this in 1948. So between 1921 and 1948, 17 states decide that their way of preserving segregation is to use tax dollars to send Black students out of state. Now, when I tell people this story, sometimes they say, that's wonderful. They got to go to such good schools. And I say, no, we really need to complicate this, right? Yeah, they might have been going to Michigan or Chicago or Harvard or Berkeley. But at the same time, these are people being made to leave their homes and communities, right? They're being made to leave their homes and communities when their parents' tax dollars are funding the education that white students are receiving at the University of North Carolina, and the education white students are receiving at the University of Georgia and every other flagship. Not just that, we have to remember that this is the era of legal segregation. So they are traveling while Black, which is not a fun experience at all, right? It's an experiment in humiliation. It is an experiment in dehumanization. So these are Black students who are having to get on trains, get on buses, and go back and forth. So I should explain, most states, including the state of North Carolina, gave you 1 round trip ticket per year. So really what that meant is they're gonna send you to New York or send you to Ann Arbor in August, and they don't expect you to come back until June. But what if your family member gets sick? What if your parent dies? What if there's some type of family emergency that requires you to come home? That financial burden is on you. When in reality, if I take my own, I'm a native of Johnson County, I could have easily probably gotten from Clayton to Chapel Hill, and back from Chapel Hill to Clayton, but getting from Clayton to Ann Arbor or Clayton to New York is not something that's easy. Many of these of the segregation scholarship recipients that I write about, some of them have written memoirs and some I've interviewed, and they all talk about, traveling while Black. So someone who's, many of you probably might remember, was a doctor by the name of Dr. Hubert Eaton. He was a doctor in Wilmington, and North Carolina paid for him to get his MD at the University of Michigan he graduated in 1942. But he talked about, he made 25 round trip bus trips between Ann Arbor, and at that time his family was living in Winston-Salem, while he was in medical school. And he talked about how, as the bus approached Virginia, the bus driver would pull over and tell all the Black people, well, now we're coming into the South, you have to move to the back of the bus. And he talks about, that was a routine. He knew when they got on a certain part of the highway, he was going to have to pick up all of his belongings and move to the back of the bus. And there are many stories like this of Black students not being served at bus stops, of Black students not being served food on trains, even though there would be a food car in that, in the train that they were riding. So there's all these indignities. There's also the indignity that many of these schools that these students go to, even though they're Northern institutions, they didn't allow Black students to live on campus. They didn't allow Black students to enter the student union or to use the library or to attend sporting events, right? So these students are not going to places that are rolling out the proverbial red carpet. So they're not wanted at home, but in their effort to secure their highest potential, they're having to study abroad, as I call it, and they're not very welcomed where they go. Now, one of the things that I try to stress in the book is that this system of forcing Black students to go out of state for the same opportunities that white students could receive in state had been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In 1938, the United States Supreme Court, in the Gaines decision, said that states had to provide the same opportunities for Black and white students within their borders. And I should say the Gaines decision, it's funded in large part by Alpha Phi Alpha. The fraternity paid many of those legal bills because Lloyd Gaines, the plaintiff, had pledged Alpha Phi Alpha at Lincoln University in Missouri. So the court says in 1938 that this is wrong, and that should ring a bell with you because I told you North Carolina started the process in 1939. What that tells us is that Southern states just, thumbed their nose at the court, and there was no federal enforcement. No one enforced that court order. So we see Southern states continuing this process, even though the court had said it was wrong. I should say in 1939, North Carolina's lawmakers thought they were slick. So they said, we need to create a few graduate programs so that it looks like we are complying with the law. So what North Carolina did was they opened the law school at North Carolina Central, and they created a few master's programs at North Carolina Central, at the time North Carolina College, and North Carolina A&T. So North Carolina A&T began offering a master's in agricultural education. Central began offering a master's in biology. They also offered a master's in chemistry and a master's in education, but those were the only programs. So if you wanted to do something other than that, you still had to go out of state. And North Carolina's lawmakers said, well, this proves that we are someone who we give our Black residents opportunity. We're not a Southern state that's denying them opportunity, even though based off of the court order, they should have made North Carolina Central, right, the exact equivalent of UNC, which they didn't have the resources to do, or they should have opened up UNC Chapel Hill to Black students, but they chose not to do that. They instituted these segregation scholarships that many states instituted. And I'll say, I'm using these 4 states, and I weave through stories of various actors. And one of the people that I write about who's still living, one of the few people, is Fred Gray. Fred Gray is an attorney in Alabama. Fred Gray graduates from Alabama A&M in 1951, and he immediately goes to Case Western Law School with a segregation scholarship from the state of Alabama. I mention him because he graduates in 1954. He immediately comes back to Alabama and sets up a law practice. He was not really making that much money, working here or there. But in 1955, when his close friend Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery City bus, he is her lawyer. He is who she calls before she even calls her husband, right? And essentially, I like to use that story because while we know the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, this was an instance where Alabama tax dollars had paid for a law degree for Fred Gray. He then uses that legal training to time and time again win segregation cases against the state of Alabama. He makes his whole career suing the state of Alabama and dismantling their system of what I would consider American apartheid. So he's someone who's still living, still practicing, but he's also someone who was a recipient of what I call these segregation scholarships.
We have a question from online.
Oh, okay.
How do we ensure the continuation of Black history and knowledge while false or incomplete information is being taught in our school system?
Oh. Well, first I'm going to say I have plenty of friends who are public school teachers. So I'm not going to say that all information being taught in our public schools is wrong. Yet there is a lot of misinformation and a lot of omission of information. So I think number one, it starts at home. I learned a lot of my foundational knowledge from my parents. I graduated from Clayton High School in 2001, and the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898 was not taught in my school. But I knew about it because my dad had taught me about it as a young child. So I think number one, it starts at home. It starts with parents deciding that they are going to ensure that their children have access to information that might not be presented in schools. And there's a variety of ways you can do that. You can attend programs like this one, making sure that you bring your kids with you. Go to public libraries, check out books, look at the events that they're holding. Reaching out to scholars every now and then. Most professors, our email addresses are actually public information. You can Google me and it comes up. People email me all the time and ask, I want my child's in the 4th grade. Is there something, age appropriate that I could give her to read on a particular topic? And typically, if I don't know the answer, I ask one of my colleagues. So really, if for anyone who's interested in making sure that their students are equipped with accurate and inclusive accounts of history, you're going to have to really do that legwork, but it's possible. It just means you can't depend on your local schools to ensure that your students are learning everything they need to learn. One of the things I'm still kind of puzzled about is the fact that in North Carolina, especially, we have many children, especially many non-white children who've never stepped foot on a college campus. And that to me is ridiculous because I say we have so many colleges. No matter where you live, you can easily get to one within 30, 45 minutes. And so one of the things I would encourage is taking your kids to events on college campuses. Whenever this pandemic is over and things reopen, every college in this state is having events. Every college has, Martin Luther King speakers. They have Black History Month events. They have Women's History Month events. I would say go to these events, meet faculty who are participating in the events, read their works, ask questions, and then that will provide you with information that you could then share with your students at home, but hopefully you brought them with you to the event so they're hearing the same information that you're hearing.
Wonderful. At this time, after Dr. Ward's next question, if you have any questions, please line up.
Okay. Next question, Dr. Sanders, we've talked about self-determination, freedom on the Hill, Princeville, North Carolina. We've talked about education. The next component is political participation. And the whole concept of coming through freedom, Reconstruction, and then starting in 1898, the total disenfranchisement. And now we see, as you mentioned in your talk, the whole voter suppression strategies of 2021. Can you give us a historical frame of reference of that pattern of disenfranchisement and how we could mirror what happened at the end of Reconstruction and see what's happening now?
Oh, that's a tall order, but I'll try. While I mentioned 1898, we could say that we began to see an erosion of African American men's political participation immediately after the end of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction ends in 1877, and we began to see really vigilante groups, really including the Klan, use intimidation to keep African American men from the polls. And I'm saying African American men intentionally because we know that Black women, we know that women in general are not given the right to vote till 1920. And we know that most Black women in the South are not voting until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we see this erosion of political activity of Black men immediately after Reconstruction through intimidation of white men basically saying, I dare you to go to the polls. If you attempt to vote, and if you live on my land, you're going to be evicted. If you chop cotton for me, you're going to lose your job. All of these, reprisals that kept African Americans from African American men from exercising their constitutional right. But while there was this, intimidation, this very much intentional, systemic intimidation, it wasn't codified. Right? It hadn't become, white people hadn't mastered how to put it in law to keep African Americans from the polls. And we began to see this perfected in Mississippi. So if we think about what happens after the Reconstruction period, white men that have been Confederates are re-enfranchised. They're given back their right to vote. They begin to once again assume federal offices. And these Southern states are having to create new constitutions. So in 1890, Mississippi creates their new constitution, and they really introduce the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause essentially said, if your grandfather could vote in 1860, then you can vote. If your grandfather couldn't vote in 1860, then you can't vote. And the reason that Mississippi lawmakers created this grandfather clause is that they were trying to find a way to disenfranchise Black men, but also be in compliance with the 15th Amendment. So if we remember, the 15th Amendment said that you could not deny male's right to vote on the basis of race. And so Mississippi could say, we don't say anything about race in this bill, right? This has nothing to do about race. It's all about if your grandfather could vote in 1860. Well, that's how we know that colorblind initiatives can be harmful, right? Colorblind initiatives are never neutral. And in this case, Mississippi perfects a way to take the franchise away from African Americans. And then we see several other Southern states following suit and doing so. And not only do they institute grandfather clauses, but they institute these literacy tests, right? Which are really these subjective tests deemed to perhaps, preserve the franchise and ensure that those who are voting have the intellectual capabilities to do so. But we know that there were many illiterate white people that do not lose their right to vote, even though literacy tests had been implemented and were supposedly being implemented, fairly, which we know they weren't. So I mention this because we see that by the 1890s, we're beginning to see the erosion of Black civil rights. And then in a place like North Carolina, North Carolina is unique in many ways, unique in the sense of the terrain, unique in the sense of the number of schools, but also North Carolina had these communities where there where interracial politics had actually succeeded, right? Where you had Black and white men working together, where you had Black and white men serving alongside one another. And that was really, there was no better example of that, what we would call fusion politics, than the city of Wilmington. And Wilmington in 1898 is like the be all end all. It's still a port city. It's still, it really has probably perhaps more clout than Raleigh, because it's this port city and you've got this interracial, cohort of elected officials. And that is a problem. For many white supremacists, it was understood that if there was ever going to be a reemergence of white supremacy, then you could not have interracial alliances. You could not have fusion politics. And so there's a deliberate and violent effort, right, to do away with this type of interracial initiative. And we see that in Wilmington. We see that there is a coup, a violent coup of really, taking away not just the political rights, but taking away the elected positions of officials solely because that they were committed to an interracial government, that they were committed to interracial or interracial organizing. And so Wilmington really is, I like to say Wilmington is a reminder of how white supremacy became so ingrained, because white supremacy becomes the cornerstone of our Southern society, in the sense that there's a push, a move away from interracial politics, and there are actually threats put on white people who want to work with Black people, right? So you essentially you don't just kill and maim and threaten Black people, but you also threaten white people who are willing to work with Black people. And what I say it's a turning point, because the federal government does nothing. So then white supremacists in other parts of North Carolina and through the rest of the South understand that there's not going to be a federal response when there's this type of lawlessness executed as a way to roll back African-American civil rights, right? We know the federal government does nothing, and they proceed to do nothing in several other race pogroms that we see going on across the country. And that is a telltale sign that without a strong federal government, there was going to be really no other entity that African Americans in the South could appeal to for the enforcement of their civil rights. And I mention that because if we think about the long history of voting rights, we see African Americans appealing to the federal government to honor and restore and protect their voting rights. And that's something that we have to do today. I mean, I'm very excited about a Juneteenth holiday. I do believe it's important that our nation acknowledges slavery and acknowledges the fact that slavery really is the institution, and enslaved people are the actors who built this country. But we actually have bigger issues. We need a voting rights bill. We need a stronger voting rights bill, because they've continued to roll back the one that we have, right? What that means for all of us here today is that, yes, we should celebrate, we should acknowledge, we should think about the resilience of enslaved people. We should acknowledge the ways in which, their sweat equity, their blood and tears truly, laid the groundwork for this nation that we all live in and enjoy today. But there is so much work to do. If we don't get a Voting Rights Act, it's not going to matter, right, that we have a Juneteenth holiday. And we see that it does matter who's in office. And it's not just who's in office at the federal level. But let's compare what happened in Elizabeth City to what happened in Minneapolis. It mattered that Keith Ellison was the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, right? I'm talking now about the George Floyd case. It mattered that we had an Attorney General in that state who was prepared to bring charges, who understood, who looked at the facts without bias. And so we need to ensure that we have district attorneys, that we have sheriffs, that we have superintendents, school superintendents, that are willing to do their jobs without bias, to do their jobs without racial bias, to do their jobs without still holding some type of commitment to white supremacy. So for that to happen, we need a Voting Rights Act that will help to ensure that we all have our right to the ballot protected, that we all have the ability to vote. It makes no sense that we want to do away with early voting, right? I would have loved a federal holiday to make Election Day off for everybody. That's the federal holiday that we need, right? But now it's gonna be harder to get that, because they're gonna say we now have 11 federal holidays. We can't make every day a federal holiday. So we really have to think about, well, what can we do? And that means advocating. I think there's a call for there's a coalition led by Stacey Abrams encouraging people to call their senators every day for 30 days. Just call them on the phone and say, hey, we're still waiting on that Voting Rights Act. We're still waiting on new legislation that's going to ensure that Southern states, or really not just Southern states, but any state in this union cannot use all types of trickery to prevent everyone from being able to participate in the electoral process. And so that's something we have to do. We owe it. We owe it to the people in Wilmington, right? We owe it to the people all across this country, whether we're talking about race riots in Atlanta or Chicago or Tulsa. We owe it to them to say, you know what, we've seen this type of stuff before. It's not always violent, but it's always, it always has the same ends, right? Which is to deny everyone access to political power, to deny everyone access to the franchise. And so our way to honor them, and the best way to celebrate Juneteenth is to say, we're going to work hard to make sure that that no one is able to take away someone else's right to vote. So that's, I think, is what takes us through that long history.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. Question, yes.
Do we have any questions from the audience? All right, come right here. I'll come to you.
It's very nice to see Dr. Ward. He first and foremost is a professor, then he was the president of St. Augustine's University. He and I worked together for a number of years. And it is also good to hear from Dr. Sanders again. I believe that you gave a presentation at the National Humanities Center, and I was a part of that audience. So it's good to see you again. I would like to ask you, are you familiar with the Flexner Report? And I'm wondering if perhaps you could comment on how detrimental that report was to the closure of so many of our Black medical schools. And I'm sure that in your comments, you might mention that Flexner was not a medical doctor. I don't know if he even had a background in science. And while you're thinking about that, I wonder if you subscribe to the notion that Ibram Kendi puts forth in his ideology, that Black people can indeed be racist if they do possess power. For so long, we have said that Black people are not capable of racism because they possess no power. But I remember reading very recently that Kendi says that persons do possess power, persons of color. And he did cite, among others, Justice Clarence Thomas. I know I gave you a lot to think about, but I'm very eager to hear your responses.
Since we're live, go ahead. Let's try to get 2 of those answers in.
Okay.
And then the other answer, just in case, is there anyone else that might have a question? Okay, so if you can get 2 of those answers in, and then I'll get that last question before our final presentation. Thank you.
To make this short, the Flexner Report was a report that was commissioned by the American Medical Association in 1910 to survey all of the medical schools in the United States and to determine which schools were fit, which schools were unfit, and I'm using these fit and unfit in quotation marks, and to helpfully bring about the standardization of medicine. What many people don't realize is that at one time there were 14 Black medical schools in the United States, including right here in Raleigh, there was the Leonard Medical School at Shaw University. And at the time of Flexner's report, there are 7 Black medical schools still in existence, including Leonard. Flexner visited all these medical schools, Black and white, and he makes a report about which schools deserve funding, which schools should be shut down, which schools exemplify the type of medical education that the AMA deemed satisfactory. And the reason this report is so significant is that there are many philanthropic organizations that have decided that they're going to steer their funds to the schools that Flexner has deemed to be fit. So if we think about the General Education Board, if we think about, which was run by Rockefeller, if we think about many of these funding agencies that had been giving money to Black institutions in particular, now all of a sudden they're saying that they're going to base their funding decisions on what Flexner, who was not a physician, he was an educational consultant. So he dibbed and dabbed in many different fields, but he really didn't know anything about medicine. And when Flexner visits these Black medical schools, he essentially says, they're not worth their salt. He says they're not really doing anything significant. He uses a very stereotypical trope about Black hygiene and the idea that these Black doctors are not equipped with the knowledge and the skills to actually treat patients. And so his recommendation when he makes his report is that all Black medical schools other than Meharry and Howard be closed. So he makes this in 1910. What that meant was that Black medical schools like Leonard began to lose funding from all of these funding agencies who decide that they're going to take Flexner at his word, even though they haven't visited these institutions, and they're going to no longer give funding to schools that did not make the cut. So he issues this report in 1910. Leonard, which was the first four-year medical school in the country, struggles. They struggle to stay afloat because now they're losing dollars, right? Because of this report that is nothing but racist. I mean, if you actually read his language, it's racist. And Leonard in particular ends up having to close its doors in 1918 because they can no longer afford to stay open. One of the things about Leonard is that it graduates 400 Black physicians, including in my home county of Johnston County. We only had one Black physician for over 50 years. His name was Dr. C.W. Furlong, and he was a graduate of Leonard Medical School. When we think about many of the Black doctors who made names for themselves in the first half of the 20th century, they are Leonard Medical School graduates. We can think of people like John Kinney, who becomes the personal physician for Booker T. Washington. He is a Leonard graduate. When we think here in Raleigh about the Pope House, Pope was a graduate of Leonard Medical School. And these are Black men who really were at the top of their game. They passed the medical exam on the first try. Leonard Medical School students are passing the medical board exam given to all Black and white physicians in North Carolina when physicians from UNC Chapel Hill are not able to pass the exam. So we know that Leonard, again, is a school that's punching above its weight. It didn't have the amenities or the funding of white medical schools, but it was able to really provide a host of well-trained Black doctors who then go into Black communities and offer critical care, and not just offering critical care, but offering critical care with a spirit of dignity. So when someone like Furlong opens up a medical practice in Smithfield, that meant Black people no longer had to enter the white door of the white doctor's office and be treated poorly, be called all kinds of names, not addressed with courtesy titles, and be dismissed, at any time if the doctor had something else to do. So when we really think about these schools, we know that we lost something, that the Flexner Report really did damage, not just in terms of closing Black institutions, but when we think of health disparities today, racial health disparities, there's a direct link between the closure of all of these Black medical schools and the lack of Black physicians to then serve in Black communities. We should also think that when these medical schools closed, it put an insurmountable burden on Howard and Meharry. You've now got two medical schools that are supposed to train and all Black people that want to be doctors. That was impossible, right? Because they have a finite number of seats. So what we see is that it really has dismal consequences for health outcomes for African Americans in the South in particular. And to your other question, first I'll say Ibram is a friend of mine, but I do not agree with this assessment that African Americans can be racist. I do think that we can all hold prejudices, right? But I do think there's a level of institutional power, right? Or connection or privilege that one needs to be able to use a prejudice to then create obstacles or create barriers for people of another race. And I don't believe that African Americans have that privilege that allows them to take their prejudices and then create obstacles or roadblocks or systemic challenges for individuals of other races.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. And we have a final question.
Thank you for your time and expertise. I really appreciate today's talk. I wanted to push a little bit beyond the previous point you just made. And in the words of Dr. Luke Wood, who mentioned that we don't really need allies, but more member of a choir, I was thinking, you mentioned all those people in position of power that we need to have them enforcing, like happened in Minnesota, enforcing the right and unbiased laws. What would be your position in terms of historical lens? How can we achieve that?
How can we achieve electing officials who are free of bias? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, because the bias is present in every one of us, right? And so I know in science we do double blind or blind studies, and you know all that. And I wanted your opinion in terms of historical opinion, how we can achieve that in our political instances.
Well, I think it's twofold. Number one, I think we can all reflect and learn more and begin to be more aware of our biases. I think there are many people who, as they learn more, particularly learn more American history, they begin to realize as they do, as they do reflections, where there may have been some areas where there's room for growth, where there's room to reevaluate their thinking, it's room to reevaluate their beliefs. So number one, that's required of all of us. I think we can all study to show ourselves approved. We can all try to learn as much as we possibly can. And then as we become more informed, that should inform our beliefs, that should inform our opinions, that should inform our actions. But then number two, as to getting more elected officials who are, I'm not going to say completely free of bias, but who are more free of bias, that requires everyday people standing up, everyday people coming forward. So a lot of times we'll say, I admire Kamala Harris. I admire her for running for office, but there are many women, perhaps in this very room, who should be running for city council, who should be running for school board, who should be running for county commissioners. So what that means is we can't always expect it to be someone else to stand up, right? We all have a role to play. And for people who find that perhaps they are very passionate about an issue, they're very passionate about the health of their school system, very passionate about the gentrification of their community, that hopefully that passion is not just gonna boil over into talking to your friends about it and being very upset as you watch the news, but perhaps saying, you know what, I'm gonna go the next step. I'm gonna run for office. Even if I don't win, as I share my ideas and my platform, perhaps that's gonna influence the person who eventually does win. So what that means is you got to get in the game, right? We can't all be spectators. And I'm not saying that means everybody has to run for office, but I do think that means there are more people who are capable of serving in elected positions who actually don't imagine that for themselves. And we really need that to happen. We've seen, I think it was 1992, they called the Year of the Women when we had all those women elected to Congress. And I think in 2020 was also a year of historic gains for women. I'm hoping that women in particular, and particularly women of color, began to say, you know what, this is a movement. There's momentum. This is not just going to be every 10, 12, 18 years. We see several women, running for office and winning, but this needs to be something constant, that we have something to share. We have something to bear. There's a quote by Anna Julia Cooper who says, when and where I enter. And she's actually saying, she's talking about Black women. And she's saying essentially when Black women enter into the room, or when Black women enter into a conversation, they're bringing their race and their sex with them, right? They have several different markers of identification. And in that same way, if we see more and more women of color stepping up and running for office, they will also be bringing all of their markers of identification with them. And with those markers of identification, comes knowledge, comes experience, comes perhaps a more sensitivity to certain biases, or a sensitivity to certain trends or certain policies that have been detrimental to people of color or detrimental to women. And so I'm hoping that means that's how we can get more and more officials who are less biased than others, but that means we all have a role to play.
At this time, you have one more question, don't you?
Not a question, but there are two people I think is important for us to remember today. First, Mrs. Opal Lee, 94 years old. We cannot celebrate Juneteenth without celebrating her. Her home was raided and burned on June 19th, 1939, when she was 12 years old. She walked from her home in 2016 from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C., some 1,400 miles, advocating for the federal holiday that we celebrate today. We must give her a round of applause. The second person is the late Al Edwards, who is a freshman member of the Texas legislature, introduced the legislation that made the state of Texas the first state in the United States to have a statewide holiday for Juneteenth. And so we need to think of him as he rests in Omega chapter of sweet rest. So those are two people that I think we've got to remember and celebrate. But as Dr. Sanders so eloquently has said, our journey continues and it all starts with us.
Wonderful. Can I have a wonderful hand of applause for our guest today?
Here, here. Here, here. Here, here. Outstanding. 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 Cheers for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So while you're standing, let me show you what gift I gave them. We have a wonderful painting in the West Building that is called Truly Grateful. It is a Beverly McIver, and we were allowed to create a mug for it. And for all that you have taught us today, we are truly grateful. And I just want to also say, when I came here 8 months ago to this position, I said that I would create remarkable multi-generational performing arts, film, and lecture programming. And I said that part of that we would explore the rich histories of our residents, that we would increase knowledge that reflects all of our diverse experiences. Of all the programs that I have produced so far, there's nothing for me that embodies that than your presentation today. Thank you all so much. We have the screening of Wilmington on Fire, which you talked about. That begins at 2 o'clock here. And then tonight we have the outdoor screening of Mr. Soul, critically acclaimed. And then tomorrow we have a celebration of Black Music Month from 3 to 7:30 p.m. Have a great day. Thank you.